So here's the plan. We're going to take the title of this video and turn it into its literal title track, right there. But before we get there, number one, just to be aware of what we're up against, we'll take a look at the surprising confusion surrounding corporate power. Like when Joaquin Fernandez rightly states that there is a great deal of deeply seated confusion about corporations, their origins, and true purpose. Then there are obviously immediate follow-up questions like, say, how is that possible? Corporate power has been with us for at least 1,500 years, so why is there still confusion about corporations? Also, as you might have noticed, the public discourse surrounding corporations is not exactly a well of knowledge. It's more like an ocean of opinions, hardly any of which pass the smell test because they simply cannot answer the question that is the title of this video. So that confusion isn't just there, it's being perpetuated on a daily basis. Which brings us to segment number 2, because the discourse surrounding corporations is not just a failure when it comes to quality, but also regarding quantity. And what I mean by that is that, as the Supreme Court pointed out a long time ago, the word corporation in its largest sense has a more extensive meaning than people generally are aware of. So we're going to heed that warning by looking at the extent of the issue of corporate power, and we're actually going to do that in 2 parts. Here, in segment 2, the waters will remain relatively calm. It basically boils down to the fact that the corporation should not be conflated with the business firm. There are many, many more corporations surrounding us in society that collectively make up the force with which the corporation has become a taken-for-granted feature of everyday life, meaning the corporate stranglehold on life, is what he meant to say that. And after looking at the extent of the term corporation, we'll get to its meaning, its conceptual core, which, let me tell you, will look so inconspicuous and so innocent, it's hard to believe that this had, and continues to have, such a world-changing effect. That's how inconsequential and normal it will appear. It's like writing a letter of attorney. I mean, how could that possibly? It's just a letter. Millions of letters are written every day. So what do you mean this is very dangerous? Kind of like that. And apart from learning what a corporation is, another crucial thing we will take away from this segment is that the power attached to corporations did and does not grow out of themselves. It is an extraneous factor, and in order to understand corporate power and how to deal with it properly, at some point we will have to ask what its source is. Which brings us to segment number 4, which, like I just mentioned, continues the issue of the extension of corporate power. In a way, it's the climax of that issue, because learning what else is on that list will make it clear that this pretty much changes everything when it comes to understanding the world we live in, including and especially the power structure of this world. Because that power structure, which obviously affects us every single day, hinges on the complex, contentious, and deeply consequential relationship between states and corporations. The latter obviously being corporations that are not states, because for about 400 years, all states have been corporations, but not the other way around. And because 400 years is obviously a different timeline compared to 1,500 years for corporations in general, in a future video we will at least briefly touch on how that came about, how the state became a corporation. We'll only do that briefly because I'm not a historian. My background is in political science and political consulting. But by all means, it will complement the insights we'll gather in this video here tonight about the difference between states and other corporations and their deeply consequential relationship David just mentioned, because it is mainly consequential for us. After which we'll end this video with some conclusions and an outlook. The conclusions will basically result in a truckload of follow-up questions like the source of corporate power I mentioned, questions about corporate ownership and control, the relationship between the corporation and the market, that's going to be a doozy, the connection between corporate power and neoliberalism, and so on. And the outlook, as you can probably guess, will refer to future videos on this channel dedicated to these questions. In that regard, the one thing that should be obvious at this point, with states themselves being corporations, is that this video series is not just an introduction to corporate power, it is an introduction to political theory and power analysis. Because if we feel powerless and lost, it is because we cannot perceive the forces that have a grip on us. That's the purpose of power analysis, revealing the forces that have a grip on us, including their relationships to each other, meaning the multi-layered power structure surrounding us. And that includes, to put it mildly, the corporation and the unexpected confusion surrounding it. Because as I've mentioned before, corporations have been with us for at least 1.5 millennia. So how on earth, after all this time, do we still not know what that construct, meaning the corporation, is, where it comes from, or how it's constituted? And the we here does not just refer to us in society, in everyday life. It also refers to the very people who are supposed to regulate what's going on in society, meaning lawyers, district attorneys, judges, including justices, and so on, for whom, according to the Harvard Law Review, corporations have long posed conceptual difficulties. That's very reassuring. And before we get to the reason for that surprising and comprehensive confusion about corporations, one thing that compounds this scenario is, of course, the fact that we're not talking about something like the many mysteries surrounding the game of chess, which is about as old as corporations, because the game of chess doesn't have a stranglehold on society and on life. When it comes to corporations, that is very obviously a different story. Not that it's really necessary, but here's the great John Kenneth Galbraith with this haunting statement. The American is controlled, livelihood and soul, by the great corporation. That was written over 70 years ago, and I know I don't have to tell you about the direction things have taken since. Meaning the confusion about corporations and, by extension, corporate power is not just surprising given their age, it's also deeply disconcerting given their overwhelming import and significance for human life all over society. At which point you might say, well, apart from the legal perspective, which is supposed to regulate things going on in society, isn't there also a scientific perspective that is supposed to help us understand the things going on in society? Which is also the point at which that surprising confusion about corporations starts to become a lot less confusing, because unfortunately our canonical social scientists fail to provide us with concepts adequate to our corporate world. There is no understanding without concepts, and our canonical social scientists, meaning economists and political scientists, fail to provide us with concepts adequate to our corporate world, because they're apparently not interested in that corporate world. For one, economists have ceased to identify corporate power as a problem worthy of serious consideration in its own right. And as much as I consider this book required reading when it comes to the analysis of corporate power, that wording would imply a previous interest in the latter on the part of economics, and I have yet to find out when that was actually the case. And, well, when it comes to my own field, things don't look any better either, because corporate power persists as one of the great enigmas of political science. And yes, this book is a little older, and we might leave it at stating that absolutely nothing has changed in the meantime. But again, I feel the need to point out that the problem actually runs deeper than what Scott says here, because enigma still insinuates a fundamental interest in the issue. And that interest, just like in the case of economics, simply isn't there. To wit, a search for the keywords corporation and corporate in the abstracts of all articles that have appeared in the last 10 years in the most highly ranking political science journal, the American Political Science Review, produced a mere 5 hits in 10 years. So our canonical social scientists do not just fail to provide us with an adequate and helpful terminology when it comes to corporate power, and the latter is not just an enigma for political science specifically. The confusion surrounding the corporation persists because the scientific stance towards it is indifference. And the one promise I can make at this point is the following. By the end of this video, not only will we have overcome the confusion surrounding corporations and corporate power, we will also have found the reason for this scientific indifference. Actually, we'll find that reason in the very next segment. Namely, the extent of corporate power, which, as we just heard the Supreme Court say, is a lot larger than is usually assumed. And actually, we don't have to speculate about what is usually assumed in this regard, because that would be the reduction of corporate power to the business corporations inhabiting the marketplace. And that assumption, like so many assumptions surrounding corporations, is wrong, because the commercial sense that we mostly associate with the term corporation today is a belated, specifically 17th century development, meaning to the historical backdrop of corporate power writ large, that is being very late to the game. Of course, as I don't have to tell you, mixing business and corporate power had an enormous impact on life. So much so that even 2 centuries later, that impact literally left people speechless. The system of corporate life is a new power for which our language contains no name. We know what aristocracy, autocracy, democracy are, but we have no word to express government by moneyed corporations. The introduction of business corporations specifically appeared to be, quote-unquote, a new power, when corporations had actually been around for many centuries in many forms. For instance, poorhouses, religious orders, from monasteries to the Knights Templar, universities like the University of Paris as early as the 12th century, Oxford even before that, cities, literally incorporated municipalities, and so on. And that diversity of corporate power has massively increased over the centuries. Of course, it is precisely this diversity that helps explain the aforementioned force with which the corporation has become a taken-for-granted feature of everyday life. The corporate stranglehold on society is so pervasive because corporate power is so pervasive, from the usual suspects like banks to insurance to AI to the corporate media, obviously, to a little less obvious, the digital corporate media, say the Wikimedia Corporation that owns and controls its Wikipedia page, to social media corporations, to YouTube channels. Yes, YouTube channels that are corporations like Timcast or the Young Turks, to bands. Yes, bands. I'm not kidding about any of this. Bands like U2 or even the Chili Peppers, those hopeless nonconformists. That's a corporation, not just a business or corporation, just like Apple, Google, or Raytheon. And no, that's still not the end of it. Of course it's not, because many movies, yes, movies, not just the corporations releasing those movies, the movies themselves, like say Lord of the Rings, are also corporations. We got sports teams, political parties, NGOs, schools, hospitals, organizations responsible for safety standards. That's reassuring. Prisons, even more so, and on and on and on. Everything I just mentioned and much, much more. Obviously a very disparate set of entities and still held together by one common feature, corporate power. Meaning corporate power is all around us because everything around us is incorporated. That is the extent of corporate power. But before we wrap up this segment, I have to deliver on my earlier promise to explain to you why science is so relentlessly uninterested in, and consequently unhelpful with, the issue of corporate power. And for that, let's look at this list again. Oh, we totally waddled over that earlier. Actually, you might say we waddled over one of the most significant manifestations of corporate power. Because while there are certainly other contenders when it comes to the very first manifestation, still, the connection between universities and corporate power has always been so tight that Adam Smith rightly stated that all incorporations used to be called universities, which is indeed the proper Latin name for any incorporation whatever. That's how deep that connection runs. To this day. Not every corporation is a university, of course, but the opposite, without exception, holds. Every single university is a corporation with a charter, just like every other corporation. And on the one hand, we could try and make light of this, like David does here. When I was young and foolish, I thought universities were so named because they aspired to universal knowledge. Now I know it just means corporation. But on a much more serious note, that is, of course, the answer to the question as to why science is so indifferent to the issue of corporate power. And by extension, why, well, corporate science will never be able to help us in that regard. Because it is deeply embedded in and a manifestation of the very power structure we expected to get a conceptual and theoretical grip on. And with science being just another part of corporate power, any semblance of impartiality, objectivity, or just interest in the issue of corporate power is, of course, as we saw earlier, an illusion. However, as we also saw and will continue to see, the silver lining here is that that does not go for each and every individual scholar. And props to every single one of them because they are working against an institutionalized corporate incentive structure. Also, let's take this moment and put a pin in that difference between individual humans, researchers at a university in this case, and the latter itself, the corporation, the incorporated entity that is the university. Because that difference between those two dimensions will turn out to be extremely important shortly. All in all, when it comes to getting a theoretical and eventually practical grip on corporate power, corporate science as an institution is about as helpful as corporate banking, because both, and for the same reason, are indifferent to the issue. We need other places to make that happen. Excuse me. And to answer these questions, the most important of which brings us to the title track of this video. And what we'll do in this segment is not just answering this question, but also encapsulating our insights into a solid definition. For one, that is simply best practice in any intellectual endeavor, but also prudent, just in case it turns out that the extent of corporate power we witnessed in the previous segment at some point reaches a sea-changing level. Because in this hypothetical scenario, we can future-proof our definition of the corporation connected to this other topic, and thereby not just get a conceptual grip on corporate power, but much more. Now, whoever has tried what we're doing right now, understanding what a corporation is, inevitably came across its most conspicuous and noteworthy feature. A corporation is not a spatial entity, it is peculiarly intangible. A corporation is not material in nature. In other words, corporations exist only in our imagination. Whatever we can literally point to, from corporate buildings to corporate employees, is in various ways connected to and associated with a corporation, but it is not the corporation itself. And while arguably the most famous statement to that effect is the Supreme Court stipulation that a corporation is an artificial being, invisible and intangible. Like I said, that feature of the corporation has remained consistent over the centuries, including in the various discourses about corporations. Now, because in those discourses, this word has also been present over the centuries, I'll mention it briefly here because it is obviously counterintuitive. Being artificial does not, at least not by necessity, imply being immaterial, invisible, and intangible. NutraSweet is artificial, but also tangible, even tasteable. The reason this is important in our context is, well, the importance of this guy, Thomas Hobbes, whose work on corporate power remains vastly influential to this day. Also, he may or may not be connected to the issue of the state being an incorporated entity itself. Anyway, when Hobbes tackled the topic of corporations, what became a massive problem was the fact that he was a materialist, meaning someone who believes that the only substance the world is made of is matter. So something that only exists in our imagination to him was simply an impossibility. Hence, when he encountered the non-material, yet very real entities that are corporations, and was trying to understand and define what a corporation is, he had predictably some issues putting that into words. Of course, Hobbes wasn't going to remain the only staunch materialist with that issue, not by a mile, or even 2 centuries. So if you've ever been wondering about what you see on the screen right now, there's your answer. But at least Hobbes tried to walk the tightrope of finding a word that describes a corporation as something that is not tangible or visible, while still keeping the whole thing in the material realm, ontologically speaking. And the somewhat awkward solution he came up with was this. That's why you see that word still mentioned in the discourse about corporations, obviously by people who don't know about its background, because like I said, it was born out of necessity and is actually not a good fit. A corporation is a non-spatial, immaterial, invisible, and intangible entity. And that is not just a consensus perspective in political and legal theory, it also tracks with the observations at the impact point of corporate power in society, where corporations, in spite of exerting overwhelming might, are completely elusive. As Edgar Allan Poe writes, corporations, it is very well known, have neither bodies to be kicked nor souls to be damned. And not just in fiction, of course, when a very attentive observer like Mary McCarthy bemoans the eerie phenomenon of society which rules everybody anonymously, she expresses precisely that elusiveness. And that also goes way back. Here's my favorite example, a staunch critic of the British East India Company, arguably one of the most powerful corporations ever. Kind of hilariously, in this piece, he addresses that corporation directly, again stressing that elusiveness. Dealing with you is a kind of dealing with spirits. Now, what all of that, these centuries of thinking, talking, and writing about corporations resulted in when it comes to casting the broadest terminological net is this. The corporation is a fiction. That is the conceptual anchor. It is, of course, not a complete definition, just its first part. And because the confusion about what a corporation is seems to be pretty much on par with the confusion about what a definition is, the question becomes, what does it mean that this right here, is only the first part of the definition of a corporation? Well, we're actually in luck here, because not only is the proper way of defining much older than corporations, it also goes back to Aristotle, meaning there is an authoritative source. Still, very briefly, because this isn't a methodology class, what we started out with is a so-called definiendum, that which is being defined, in our case, a corporation. And what the definiendum is being defined by, the definiens, is what we're looking for. Now, when it comes to the latter, the definiens itself comprises two parts, the first of which we just saw. It is the closest species of the definiendum, like a stallion is a horse, a sedan is a car, football is a sport, a bachelor is a man, a triangle is a polygon, a widow is a woman, a mayor is an office holder, a constitution is a law, and so on. And in the case of a corporation, as our definiendum, the closest species is a fiction. Of course, in theory, we can continue this process. For instance, the closest species of a stallion is a horse, and the closest species of the latter would be a mammal. Next, we get to an animal, and so on. Now, as you might have noticed, the closest species is always broader than the definiendum itself. The latter is part of the former, but they're not identical. There are more horses than stallions, meaning while every stallion is a horse, not every horse is a stallion. Every sedan is a car, but not the other way around. Football is a sport, but thankfully not the only one. Every mayor is an office holder, but not the other way around, and so on. So the second question in every definition is, what singles out the definiendum inside the closest species? What makes a stallion and not just a horse? What makes a mayor and not just an office holder? What makes a corporation and not just a fiction, and so on? And the answer to that question is called the specific difference. That's what singles out the definiendum inside the closest species. So a bachelor is an unmarried man. A constitution is a foundational law. A widow is a woman whose spouse has passed. A mayor is an office holder who's the head of the executive of a municipality, and so on. Meaning, when it comes to the definition of a corporation, we got our work cut out for us. What is the specific difference when it comes to the fiction that is the corporation? To be sure, there will be much more to say about the closest species, the corporation as a fiction, down the road, because there are obviously a lot of follow-up questions, specific ones like fiction, whose fiction? And broader questions like, if corporations are fictions, how can fictions have any power? How does this work? And like I said, we'll get to all of that in the future. But for now, in order to have a solid definition to build on, we need that second part, the specific difference. What singles out a corporation among fictions in general? Well, here's our answer with two clear-cut features. A corporation stands apart with a distinct identity of its own. That's the first feature, a separate identity, capable of action in its own right. That's the second one, agency. So the fictitious entity that is the corporation has a distinct identity of its own in every single case. In the words of the Supreme Court, the corporate owner/employee, a natural person, is distinct from the corporation itself. That's the first part of the specific difference. That's why there are numerous corporations, each uniquely identifiable with their own name. So when Runciman says that a corporation stands apart, that does refer to other corporations. But of course, what that also means, as the Supreme Court says here, is that a corporation stands apart and has a distinct identity independent of and from the human beings associated with it. Incorporation's basic purpose is to create a legal entity distinct from those natural individuals who created the corporation or whom it employs, or any human being for that matter, because on a very general level, the existence of a corporation presupposes the existence of something beyond individual human beings. Obviously, because those individual human beings are not fictions. And that distinct identity and existence of every single corporation, independent of and from human beings, was there from the very beginning. It has always been a defining feature of the corporation. Here's the Justinian Law Codex from the 6th century. A debt to a corporation is not a debt to individuals, and a debt of a corporation is not a debt of individuals. Both are different realms, and the corporation exists in its own. And again, throughout the centuries, that has not just been stipulated at the origin point of corporate power. It has also been noticed at its impact point. Here's another attentive observer, the great John Steinbeck. The bank is something else than men. There it is. It happens that every man in a bank hates what the bank does, and yet the bank does it. The bank is something more than men. And when we look at this carefully, we can also see the second feature, the second part of the specific difference in there. The bank does it. The bank, like every corporation, is, quote, capable of action in its own right, what we today refer to as agency. In other words, a corporation is able to manage its own affairs. Corporations have agency. Actions are assigned to them, not the human beings involved, which from the perspective of the latter is of course very helpful if it should turn out that these actions run counter to the law. Hypothetically speaking, of course, meaning criminal law is actually the place where corporate agency comes to the fore in the most obvious way, because assigning responsibility to the separate entity that is the corporation means the people involved, say in management, are off the hook. So things like limited liability and other corporate privileges, in effect, benefit the empirical boardroom, not the fictitious entity that is the corporation. And that has actually gotten a lot more pronounced over the last century. So while in 1916, famous political philosopher Harold Lasky wrote, "It needs but a little courage, and the reality of corporate crime will pass into the current coin of legally accepted doctrine." Less than a century later, the UK actually passed the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act. What a name. The point being, of course, that this legal responsibility rests on the assigning of agency to individual corporations. So with these two features of separate identity and agency, we have the specific difference of the corporation inside the closest species of fictions, meaning we have the definition of a corporation as a fiction with a separate identity and agency. And as I've mentioned, while that is a full definition, it is of course only the starting point of our journey. It is basically the candle that will guide us through the dark cave of corporate power. Plus, this is a clear-cut definition, so the light of our candle is actually pretty bright. And considering the two defining corporate features of separate identity and agency, what we can see in front of us right now is that these two features of the corporation are also the defining features of a state. Oh. Well, I told you there was a surprise entry coming, which at this point might actually and admittedly not be that surprising anymore. Still, I have to tell you, back when I was teaching poli-sci and especially political theory, this part, predictably, was always the biggest curveball of the whole semester. Because when you've been hearing and reiterating a fable about the division between the economy and the state, or for that matter, society writ large and the state, learning that the power mechanics on both sides of that supposed divide are identical is bound to be counterintuitive. I fully understand that. Yet for us, at this point, things will fall into place pretty quickly, because we already got all the pieces we need, and we know where those pieces belong, because we have the structure of a definition. So the fact that the state fulfills all the elements of the definition of a corporation is not going to surprise us. Starting with the fact that the state, having a real existence as a corporation, becomes a peculiarly intangible presence. Yup. That sounds familiar, especially when you're trying to analyze this thing, in that the state has proven a remarkably elusive object of analysis. The state showcases the same intangibility as any corporation, the same elusiveness, because it is also a fiction. And when it comes to the specific difference of a corporation, separate identity and agency, we already heard David say that these two features of the corporation are also the defining features of a state. In other words, states can be thought of as having identities and performing actions. Just like with corporations in general, the state's separate identity leads to it being a standalone reference point in any regard, especially, and again, independent of the human beings involved, because the state is separate from all the political actors with whom we are most familiar: governments, law officers, civil servants, citizens. And when it comes to agency, well, Runciman's actually not the only political theorist who doesn't leave it at pointing out the state's ability to act in its own right, with states being the overwhelming power unit on this planet by a mile. You could truly say that this power mainly rests on the state's ability to act. And with the state having all the elements of the definition of a corporation checked, the Supreme Court, as we already saw, draws the ineluctable conclusion that all states, whatever, are corporations. And that insight has stuck around into the 19th century. For instance, from a textbook on corporate law, the United States may be termed a corporation. It may be so said of each state singly. Into the 20th century, with arguably the greatest theorist on corporate power ever, Frederick Maitland, there seems to be a genus of which state and corporations are species. They seem to be units, goes to separate identity. We seem to attribute acts and intents to these units, goes to agency. And as we saw earlier, into our century. And just one last example, this is from James Wilson's famous yard speech in Philly between the convention and the ratification of the Constitution, where he said, "This projected system," that would be the United States of America, "is nothing more than a formal act of incorporation." That about sums it up. However, what all of that obviously does not mean is that state and corporation would be identical and interchangeable concepts. If that were the case, we'd hardly be hearing about the complicated relationship between state and corporation. The main reason that relationship is so complicated is that while all states, whatever, are corporations, the opposite does not hold. All states are corporations, but not all corporations are states, meaning states are a subset of all corporations. And in the framework of our definition, we know exactly what that means. Hence, when we define the state, when we make the state our definiendum, the concept of the corporation is the closest species of the concept of the state. Just like horse is the closest species of a stallion, office holder is the closest species of a mayor, polygon is the closest species of a triangle, corporation is the closest species of the state. States are a subset of all corporations, so naturally the question becomes, what is the specific difference when it comes to the state? What sets a state apart from all other corporations? And for about 400 years by now, the answer to that question has remained the same. The state is defined by its possession of sovereignty. That is the specific difference that singles out the state among the closest species of all corporations. Hence, we distinguish states and corporations because the former and only they are sovereign. Sovereignty is monopolistic because at any given moment there can be only one legitimate claimant to political authority and allegiance, and that is the state. The overwhelming force states are able to exert today certainly has to do with the fact that they are themselves manifestations of corporate power. Then again, so is every other corporation by definition. However, those latter corporations are not sovereign. What sets the state apart regarding both its definition and its power is its monopolistic claim to sovereignty, meaning we can define the state as a sovereign corporation. Obviously, the direct result of that, namely the complex, contentious, and deeply consequential relationship between states and corporations, will be an issue to come back to in the future, because this relationship might take place between states and corporations. It is, however, and again, deeply consequential for us. The silver lining here, also for us, is that the presence of corporate power both in society and stateside will give us many opportunities to transfer insights we've gained on one side of that line to the other, and vice versa, which is something that in political theory, to this day, nobody does. Well, what can I say? Welcome to corporate power. Thanks for sticking around. I realized this was a lot to take in right at the start, but I can assure you it was crucial to at least get our bearings in this insanely large and complex power landscape. Elden Ring is a patch of grass compared to that. And like I said, with our nice and shiny candle, our definition, and understanding of what a corporation is, we are very well equipped to full-on tackle all of the follow-up questions and topics we could only brush by tonight. And in every single case, meaning in every single future video, we will be able to direct those questions and answers to both corporations in general and the state in particular. Here are just a few upcoming topics and videos, starting with an obvious one. Because if corporations are fictions, and they are, how can they exert influence over the non-fictitious world, our lives? On a more general note, how can fictions have any power? And that issue runs even deeper than corporate power. It goes to sheer corporate existence. Because if anything is to be a corporation, some explanation has to be given of how such entities come into existence in the first place. How do fictions come to exist? Whose fictions are they? Where are they? And again, how can they be so powerful? How does all of this work? Or just any of it? The good news is all these questions have a, as in one, clear-cut answer, because corporate power has a, as in one, clear-cut source. Also, like I said, while corporate power has been with us for way over a millennium, it wasn't until about 400 years ago that states became corporations. And while given that number, it's easy to assume that that had mainly to do with the 30 Years' War, it was actually something else. The bloodiest conflict on English soil ever, the English Civil War. We'll go into the fascinating concept of the king's two bodies and how the king's second body, the kingdom, was eventually ripped from his first or natural body as a standalone entity, the state. And as the most consequential outcome of that conflict towards the end of the 1640s, the English state was now being imagined as a corporate entity. So we have a time-restricted event whose underlying political ramifications are still present today. And if you put it that way, the political animals among you will no doubt realize that at the same time that very scenario repeated, because since the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, the global political system has principally involved the interactions of sovereign states. By the end of that second conflict, the 30 Years' War, also at the end of the 1640s, states had become the biggest power player in the world. It, the end of the war, established state sovereignty as the fundamental ordering principle of the state system, placing the state at the center as the unambiguous locus of authority. Meaning the very moment the state became a corporation, it turned into the most powerful political unit on this planet. If that doesn't tell you everything there is to know about corporate power, nothing ever will. So that video will be my grand and only contribution to historiography, I promise. Coming back to the present, what awaits us is another discourse in a pathetic state about an issue closely related to corporate power, namely neoliberalism. In spite of the latter being the dominant ideology surrounding us, the question what neoliberalism actually is or stands for is still widely unknown, meaning there will be a video about the relationship of corporate power to neoliberalism. And in the meantime, for those curious about neoliberalism, there's actually an hour-long movie version on this channel about that very question, what is neoliberalism? Yes, it's the backrooms. I love the backrooms. Leave me alone. So if you're both curious and impatient in that regard, you're welcome to check it out. I also go into the relationship between neoliberalism and Marxism. What can I say? It's a deep dive. Meanwhile, another video will be dedicated to the absolute low point of the already disastrous discourse surrounding corporations, ownership and control. Among the many misconceptions in that space, the myth of shareholder ownership is arguably the biggest culprit. Shareholders do not own a corporation. They own shares. They don't even have the right to receive a dividend, as every Apple shareholder can tell you. The assets of a corporation, from buildings to pencil sharpeners, are owned by that corporation. That is the direct result of its separate identity and agency, meaning no less than a socialist economy, but through devices more opaque, our economy is dominated by property unowned by natural individuals, because it is owned by corporations, and no natural individual owns a corporation, including the shareholder. We will extend this disaster to the issue of corporate control. It's just not going to get any better from there. Let's just say Akin remains unbeaten with his assessment. Speaking of deeply seated confusion, we will also tackle another huge misunderstanding related to corporations, which is the assumption that because they impact society, including and especially the marketplace, that means they must also have originated there. That's pretty much like saying the comet wreaks havoc on the planet, hence, it must have grown on that planet. Corporations are an extraneous factor in the marketplace. If anything, there is a rift between corporate power and the logic of the market, whatever you think about the latter per se. And that is an insight that goes back about a century by now. Meaning whoever has looked at corporate power from the perspective of the market has inevitably walked away with one question, and one question only. And for that matter, way beyond the marketplace, you could ask that same question for every single segment, every single institution of society, which is exactly what we're going to do. Corporations are not just a foreign element to the marketplace, but society writ large. Luckily, by that point, we will already know the answer to the obvious follow-up question: where do corporations come from? And as our last example, we'll return to campus with the depressing answer to the question why science, as an institution, cannot help us with corporate power. And while we do know the general answer to that question, we will dig deeper in this video. And not just for people who still believe that the academy, the home of reason, is still the hope of the world, meaning people like myself. But just to show you how real this problem is, the problem of the university as a corporation, you might remember this segment of The Grapes of Wrath, showcasing the definitional corporate features of separate existence and identity. And the reason we're looking at this again is that when people think about the evil, or at least the dangers of corporate power, one case in point they have in mind, I would argue, is a corporate bank. So when seemingly at the other end of that corporate spectrum we talk about the university as a corporation, those two things seem to be so far removed they're basically polar opposites, right? And while that might be true to some extent, as a final word tonight on the pervasive force of corporate power, let's first look at this example again. The bank is something else than men. It happens that every man in a bank hates what the bank does, and yet the bank does it. The bank is something more than men. And with that in mind, here is David Runciman again, a dyed-in-the-wool academic about his corporate employer. So I work for a university. I have no idea how it reaches the decisions that it reaches, and I suspect the people who design its decision-making procedures have no idea. This university does stuff, and everyone involved goes, "What?" Speaking from experience, I can tell you, that about sums it up. So I hope you'll join me on this journey. In any case, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you around.
That the state is a fiction and yet the state is a sovereign power. But how can a fiction declare war? How can a sovereign fiction put you in jail? How can fictions have any power?
We distinguish states and corporations because, and I would say fundamentally only because, the former are sovereign.
The state is an agent, capable of action, or it is nothing.